You know what's terrifying about the moon? It feels permanent. It feels locked in place, like the sky has one stable rule you can trust no matter what happens down here. We argue about wars, markets, politics, storms, but the moon stays there like a calm witness, the same face, the same rhythm, the same tides rolling in like a metronome. And that's why this story hits different, because 3i Atlas didn't just pass through and leave a pretty tale. It may have done something quieter and way more serious. Not a crash, not an explosion, not a headline you can photograph, just a subtle change in the moon's orbit, small enough to miss with your eyes, but big enough to move the tides. If that sounds impossible, good, it should. Because the moon is massive, and its orbit is one of the most measured motions in all of astronomy. We laser the moon. Literally, we bounce lasers off reflectors left on the surface and measure distance down to centimeters over time. So when the measurements started showing a tiny drift that didn't match the model, the first reaction was the same boring shield as always. Calibration, atmosphere, clock error. Anything except the idea that something touched the most stable clock in our sky, but the drift kept showing up across systems, different stations, different conditions, same direction, same timing, same uncomfortable curve. And it didn't look like the moon randomly wobbling. It looked like the moon being nudged, like someone put a fingertip on a spinning coin and changed the balance. Now here's the part people miss. You don't need to move the moon by kilometers to change the tides. You only need to change the timing. Tides are a dance between Earth and moon. If the beat shifts by a fraction, the water doesn't ask permission. It follows the new rhythm. That means the danger isn't the moon will fall. The danger is subtle. Coastal systems behave differently. Currents shift slightly. Storm surges stack differently. It's not the kind of threat that screams. It's the kind that quietly rewrites the background of the planet while everyone argues about the foreground. So why blame 3i Atlas? Because the timing of the anomaly lines up with the object's closest influence window. Not a physical flyby near the moon, but a geometry moment where its path, the sun's pressure, and Earth's magnetosphere all align like gears. And what makes 3i Atlas special isn't just where it came from, it's how it behaves. It doesn't act like a dumb rock falling on rails. It has already shown hints of course correction, hints of precision, hints that it can do work without looking like it's doing work. So when we saw the moon's orbit drift, the ugly question formed on its own. Did the object interact with the Earth-Moon system on purpose? Because you can nudge an orbit in more ways than people imagine. You don't need a giant engine. You need a mechanism that couples to force. Gravity is the obvious one, but gravity alone is smooth. It doesn't create sharp changes unless something passes extremely close. This drift wasn't a sharp kink. It was a gentle offset that appeared like a step, then stayed consistent like a new baseline was set. That's the signature of an impulse. A small change delivered in a short window, and after that the system behaves normally, just on new rails. So what could deliver an impulse without leaving a visible mark? The answer sits in the part of physics most people never think about. Fields, plasma, magnetism, the invisible structures around Earth that act like a shell, constantly interacting with the solar wind. Earth isn't naked in space, it wears a magnetic cloak that stretches far beyond the atmosphere, and it has boundaries that can flex and snap. If 3i Atlas can couple to that cloak, even briefly, it could transfer momentum through a mechanism that looks like nothing in visible light. And if you can transfer momentum into Earth's environment, the moon doesn't stay untouched, because the moon is tied to Earth's gravitational rhythm. Think of it like pushing a swing by pushing the air around it. You don't touch the seat, but the seat still moves because the system is connected. Now here's where it gets darker. The drift wasn't random in effect. The tide timing shift wasn't uniform. Some stations saw an earlier peak. Others saw an oddly delayed pull, as if the equilibrium point of the tidal bulge had rotated a hair. That implies direction, not just magnitude, a directional preference in the change, like the nudge had a vector, not just a general disturbance. Natural disturbances don't pick clean vectors unless they come from a clean source. And the cleanest source in the timeline is 3i Atlas itself. So the moon didn't change orbit like a dramatic movie scene. It changed by millimeters in distance and microseconds in timing, but microseconds are deadly when they stack, because the ocean is patient and it integrates every tiny shift into a new pattern. That means the real proof isn't one measurement, it's accumulation. A slow deviation from the predicted tidal calendar that gets harder to ignore. And that's exactly what started happening. Minor anomalies in tidal charts. Harbors reporting oddly early highs. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that makes the news. Just enough for scientists to quietly start comparing notes, and once you compare notes, you realize the changes line up with the moon's orbital phase in a very specific way. The drift doesn't grow evenly. It clusters around certain alignments, like the system was nudged into a slightly different resonance. That's the kind of thing that makes a room go quiet, because resonance is not about brute force, it's about timing. If you push at the right moment, you don't need strength, you need precision. And precision is exactly what 3i Atlas keeps hinting at. So the question becomes brutally simple. Was the moon's orbit nudged as a side effect, or was it used as a tool? Because the moon is not just a rock, it's Earth's stabilizer. It regulates tides, affects rotation, and anchors the rhythm of the planet. A tiny change in that rhythm is like turning a screw on a giant machine. You won't hear it click, but the machine behaves differently afterward. And if someone wanted Earth to behave differently, even slightly, the moon is the most elegant lever you could pull. Now the real fear isn't that 3i Atlas attacked anything. The real fear is that it tested the lever. Just a test, a small adjustment. A proof that the system can be influenced without explosions, without contact, without leaving obvious fingerprints. Because if you can shift the tides by barely measurable amounts, you've proven a point. You've proven that Earth is not isolated, that our biggest natural clock can be touched. And the moment that idea becomes real, the next thought follows automatically. If it can do that once, it can do it again. The trick isn't moving the moon like a billiard ball. The trick is nudging the system just enough that the moon moves itself afterward, because orbital mechanics never forget a tiny push. If you want the moon to drift without looking forced, you don't slam it. You tap the timing, you tap the resonance, and you let gravity do the rest in slow motion. That's why the anomaly felt so wrong in the data. It didn't look like a violent event, it looked like a new baseline, as if the orbit accepted a tiny change and then kept living with it. So what could deliver a clean impulse without a visible plume, without a shockwave, without a giant object flying close enough to raise alarms? Gravity alone can't do it unless something passes uncomfortably near, and 3i Atlas never came close enough to physically pull the moon by pure mass, not in any ordinary way. Which leaves you with the invisible layer people ignore. The Earth-Moon system isn't just two rocks in empty space, it's wrapped in plasma, fields, and moving charged particles. Earth has a magnetic shield that stretches far beyond the atmosphere. It's not a bubble that sits still, it breathes, it flexes, it snaps under pressure from the solar wind. And the moon, even without a strong global field, still interacts with that environment. It passes through regions of charged flow, wakes, and boundaries that can act like soft rails. Now here's where the story stops sounding like comet drama and starts sounding like engineering. If you can shape plasma flow, you can create pressure without touching anything solid. Not pressure like air in a room. Pressure like a moving river of particles pushing on whatever it flows around. The way wind pushes a sail without asking permission. You already know this is real because we've built concepts around it. Magnetic sails, plasma braking, electrodynamic tethers, all of them trade fields for force quietly. So imagine 3i Atlas carrying something you can't see well. Not an engine, not a bright structure, but a temporary sheath, a charged skin that can grab the flow for minutes. If that sheath turns on only during perfect alignment, you don't get a long burn. You get a short, clean shove that looks like a small correction in a spreadsheet. But that shove doesn't need to hit the moon directly. It only needs to shift Earth's near-space environment enough to change the tug pattern the moon feels over hours. That's the key. The moon's orbit is stable, but it's not isolated, and small changes in the system's energy can show up as tiny phase shifts. And phase shifts are poison because they stack. A microsecond shift today becomes a measurable tidal difference later, and by then, nobody remembers what caused the first microsecond. That's why the change was spotted first in timing, not distance. The laser ranging didn't scream, "The moon moved away," it whispered, "The rhythm changed." So what would 3i Atlas actually be doing during that alignment? Not pushing like a rocket, but coupling like a key fitting into a lock, using the system's own motion as leverage. You can picture it like this. A door is heavy, but if you push at the hinge side with the right angle, it swings easily and it looks effortless. The moon is the door, Earth's field environment is the hinge, and 3i Atlas is the hand that briefly found the perfect angle. That would explain why the event happened in a narrow window. You don't get that kind of coupling whenever, you get it when geometry lines up and the field is already stressed, and it would explain why the effect didn't keep growing wildly. A controlled impulse doesn't keep accelerating, it shifts the state, then the natural system continues from the new starting point. Now here's the part that makes the room go colder. The impulse didn't just shift the moon's timing, it also changed the way the tidal bulge tracked across certain coastlines. That's a directional fingerprint, a sign the push wasn't symmetric. Nature tends to smear symmetry, but controlled interaction can leave a preferred direction. So the question becomes less about can it happen and more about why choose that direction. Because direction implies intention, and intention implies a goal beyond showing off. If 3i Atlas wanted to test precision, the moon is the perfect target. It's the best monitored object near Earth, meaning any successful nudge proves you can act under observation. And if you can act under observation and still look natural, you've passed the hardest test. You've proven you can touch the system without triggering the world's alarm instincts. That's why I don't think this was an accident. Accidents don't pick elegant levers, they smash into things and leave chaos, heat, noise, and debris behind. This was clean, a quiet touch that left the sky looking normal and the oceans behaving slightly different, like a small lie planted inside a huge routine. And once you see it that way, the next fear arrives on its own. If the moon can be nudged, then the whole Earth system can be tuned. Not violently, but subtly. Because tides aren't just beach waves. They feed currents, they shape temperature layers, they influence mixing, and mixing changes storms over time. So a tiny adjustment isn't nothing. It's a long-term lever that can shift patterns without creating a single obvious disaster anyone can point to. That's why the moon drift matters more than a bright explosion would. Explosions make headlines and responses, but tiny shifts become normal before anyone realizes normal changed. And the most unsettling piece is still ahead. Because if 3i Atlas tested the moon once, the next test won't be a repeat of the same trick. It will be a bigger lever. Something closer to Earth's daily systems, something that affects timing, power, and stability in ways that we can't ignore. At first, no one wanted to believe that the tides had actually shifted, because it sounds like nonsense, until you remember how closely the ocean usually follows the lunar schedule. Ports and engineers operate according to these tables, ships enter by the minute, and even small fishing bays sense when the water arrives off schedule, although it's almost impossible to spot with the naked eye. The first signals looked harmless, somewhere the peak came a little earlier, somewhere a little later, and this can easily be attributed to the wind, pressure, season, anything, just not to touch the moon. But then it became clear that these were not isolated failures, because the errors began to repeat themselves in the same phases, and this is precisely what kills the version about normal weather. The weather may raise or lower the water, but it does not create a global pattern that adjusts again and again to the lunar cycle, as if someone had shifted the timestamp itself. Then they turned on more rigorous testing, not just coastal sensors, but satellite altimetry and ocean mass distribution maps that see the tide as a shape, not as noise, and the satellites confirmed what no one wanted to say. There really is a small phase shift and it persists, as if a tidal wave were arriving at a new rhythm and not by chance. The most unpleasant thing about this is that the shift did not manifest itself in the same way everywhere, but with a direction, as if the ocean had not simply been rocked, but as if it had been slightly turned, like a hand on a clock face. This is important because chaos usually blurs the picture. But here, on the contrary, a vector appears, and a vector most often means an impulse, that is, a short push at the right moment. At the same time, laser measurements of the moon showed not just drift, but drift with fixation, as if the system had adopted a new equilibrium point and then calmly continued to live in it. This is not how ordinary random disturbances behave. They float, disappear, and average out. But here it feels like someone adjusted the setting once and the setting remained. In orbital parameters, it looked almost comical. Microscopic changes in ovality and timing of closest approach, but they were consistent, as if they were the traces of a single event. I'll translate this into human terms. The orbit has changed slightly in shape and time, so little that there won't be panic, but enough to change the water schedule on the planet. And once you accept this, the question that makes your fingers go cold arises: who benefits from moving the moon a little if the goal is not destruction, but control over the cycle? The moon doesn't just drive the waves, it sets the rhythm of the ocean's mixing, and the ocean is the Earth's enormous thermal engine, and a small shift in the gear changes the operation of the entire mechanism. This is why the story quickly spread beyond astronomers, because oceanographers and navigation services look at tides not as a romantic notion, but as a basic coordinate system. They began to notice things that usually behave like clockwork. Current boundaries appeared a little earlier, internal waves arrived out of phase, but half a step out of phase. It didn't feel like a disaster, and that's precisely the danger. Because when changes are quiet, people get used to them and call them the new normal before they even understand the reason. But the accumulation of data breaks the calm because the chain of events begins to unfold too smoothly. The alignment window, the reaction of the environment, the impulse, then a stable shift. And the more you look, the less space there is for honest chance. Because chance doesn't like to repeat a pattern, it likes to disintegrate into chaotic spots. The most alarming thing happened later when everyone expected the effect to dissipate, that the system would return to the previous forecasts, but this did not happen. The shift persisted too confidently. And then a new detail appeared, which at first they tried to ignore, a tiny periodic tremor in the distance measurements, like a weak pulse repeating too accurately. It could have been attributed to the equipment, the temperature, the atmosphere, or any minor everyday reason, but the problem was that this trembling coincided with changes in the solar wind differently than before. That is, the moon seemed to begin to pass through the Earth's magnetic tail differently, as if the environment around us remained altered after the event, like a memory that cannot be erased by one explanation. If the environment remembers, then it can be used again. Because repetition is the most dangerous word in such stories, it turns strangeness into method. And then it becomes clear that the main test is still ahead, because the real test is not whether this happened once, but whether it will happen again at the next alignment. If a second impulse occurs in a different phase, no one will be able to call it an error, because two coincidences in a row in such a system sound like a signed document. And here an unpleasant thought arises. Perhaps the moon was not a goal, but a calibration. A demonstration of precision, an attempt to show that our eternal mechanism can be accessed from the outside. Because the logic of control is always like this. First you touch the most observable object and don't get caught, and then you realize that less observable systems will be even simpler. And this means that the story of the tides is not about water or the romance of the night sky, but about the fact that someone was able to shift the rhythm of the planet so that it didn't even scream. The next alignment window didn't look like an event. It couldn't be photographed. It couldn't be pointed out. It was simply a moment when the system's geometry became too convenient for outside interference. The scientists were waiting for it like a trap, because now they knew what to look for, and they understood that the second impulse would turn everything into a repeating pattern, and a repeating pattern is not an accident. The most unpleasant thing was that the window was closer to Earth along the observation line, which meant that any equipment errors should have disappeared as soon as clean, calm telemetry began. When the time came, nothing thundered or flashed, but a familiar tint appeared in the data. The background began to behave differently, as if space had momentarily become denser and more viscous. It felt like a subtle compression of reality, not at the level of fantasy, but at the level of statistics, where noise suddenly becomes too organized and begins to hold shape. Then the main thing began, and it was terrifying, precisely because of its modesty. The moon seemed to shift a fraction of a fraction, and the orbital model began to diverge from the actual trajectory. It wasn't a fall or a jump, it was like a neat step of a millimeter to the side, but the step happened exactly when it was advantageous, and this is what gave away someone else's calculation. At that moment, the ocean did not yet understand anything, but the system was already changing, because the tides are not separate waves, but a huge mechanism that reacts to phase shifts. And then something happened that knocked the wind out of even the calmest of people. The shift was repeated, not identically, but according to the same principle, as if someone had applied a second stroke. In the orbital data, this looked like a new microscopic pulse, and after it the parameters calmed down again, as if the goal was not to accelerate the moon, but to fix the setting. This made and left profile is very difficult to explain by nature, because nature loves continuation, loves the tails of processes, but here there was a feeling of a switch. Immediately after that, little inconsistencies started popping up all over the world, and people didn't even connect them together because each one looked harmless on its own. In some places, the tide came in a couple of minutes earlier. In some places, the water pressure at the piers changed differently than usual, and in some places, the currents began to behave as if they had been slightly turned. When these things were put together into one map, it turned out that they repeated the structure of the first shift, only now the pattern became clearer and wider, as if the system had entered a new mode. The worst thing was the reaction of the magnetic environment data, because that same trembling appeared again, but now it was stronger and lasted longer than last time. It looked as if the channel of influence had become more stable, as if after the first touch a path remained in space and after the second the path had strengthened. To put it simply, the first impulse was like a scratch on the ice, and the second made a furrow out of the scratch, making it easier to slide over it again and again. And it was then that the most cautious people said something that cannot be taken back. We may not be observing the strangeness of an object, but the work of an instrument that opened up next to us. Because if two impulses occurred in the right windows, it means someone chooses the windows, chooses the moments, and this is no longer about a glitch or a lucky accident. And 3i Atlas in this picture appears not as the cause of chaos, but as a user who knows how to activate influence precisely where it produces maximum effect with minimal risk. Now the most important thing was to understand what exactly was changing in the orbit, because shifts come in different forms. Some affect distance, others affect tilt, and others affect phase. And observations have shown that the main impact occurs in phase, and at the points of maximum tidal force. That is, it is not where the moon is that changes, but when the moon does its job. This is 100 times more dangerous for Earth systems because the time shift is stronger than the distance shift. It changes schedules and regimes, but it does so without external drama. The ocean began to behave like a person whose sleep schedule had been changed to 15 minutes a day. It seemed to be alive, but gradually its entire body began to function differently. And the longer the new rhythm lasted, the stronger became the feeling that the goal was not to show strength, but to imperceptibly reconfigure the familiar. The worst thing about this is that people quickly get used to the new schedule because they don't see the reason. They just rewrite the tables and call it an amendment, and if someone wanted to intervene without anyone shouting, then this is the ideal way, a small correction that can be passed off as a model update. But there is one problem that cannot be swept under the rug. The second event provided a new correlation, and it linked angular momentum to the behavior of space near the Earth. Signals from deep space arrived, with micro delays at these moments, as if space had become slightly less transparent, and this coincided with the point where the moon shifted. It doesn't look like the atmosphere because different stations saw the same thing, and it doesn't look like a hardware error because different instruments repeated the effect. And then a thought comes to mind that makes you want to close your laptop. Perhaps the corridor of influence is not near distant planets, but almost here, next to us. If that's true, then 3i Atlas didn't just fly by and disappear, it activated something that now exists in our area, like an invisible button in space. And if there's a button nearby, it means the next step will be bolder, because the long-range tests have already been completed, and now we can touch not the moon, but what's closer to our world. That's why the next cycle of observations looked less like scientific work and more like waiting for a blow, because everyone understood that the third touch might not be on the water. After the second impulse, a strange feeling hung in the air as if someone had checked the two doors and made sure that they opened the same way and was now about to enter not cautiously, but confidently. People were waiting for the third touch, not because they wanted drama, but because the third event would be the most honest. It would show whether this was a series of coincidences or a repeatable technology. The most unpleasant thing is that the third alignment window fell at a time when the Earth's systems are especially sensitive, when the magnetic environment is stable and any oddities are more clearly visible. And when that date approached, the alarm began, not with the telescopes, but with things that shouldn't have anything to do with comets in space at all. Timing, communication, and synchronization. Several networks around the world experienced micro-time glitches. It wasn't that the clock stopped or that the power went out, but that some systems simply went out of phase for a second. It sounds funny until you realize that the entire modern world depends on the precise timing of the nodes. Otherwise, everything starts to get confused and break down. Satellite links produced a strange effect, as if the signal was passing through a more viscous medium, and the delays were too consistent to be attributed to random loading. A pair of weather satellites sent out garbled data packets for a minute, then returned to normal, as if someone had momentarily altered the transmission conditions in space itself. At the same time, ground-based observatories saw a familiar picture. The background in a certain area became darker and smoother, as if someone had cut out a piece of the sky and replaced the texture. It was the same shape, the same signature, the same effect that had appeared as a corridor before, only now it appeared closer, and because of this it was easier to catch. And at the moment when this zone became most pronounced, laser measurements of the moon again showed a jolt. Very small, but too clean to be mistaken for noise. The third touch was not stronger, it was more precise, as if the first and second attempts had tuned the instrument and now the instrument had hit the ideal frequency. If you imagine it simply, then before someone was groping for the steering wheel in the dark, but now the steering wheel has already been found, and the turn is made smoothly, as if it were a normal part of the movement. And immediately after the shock, the ocean again began to lag or hurry, but now the changes affected not only the shores, but also deep internal currents, which usually live separately. This is a bad sign, because deep currents react slowly and reluctantly, and if they begin to shift in phase, it means that the changes affect the very energy of the system. The strangest thing was that the shifts seemed like a response, not an accident, as if the moon and the ocean had not simply been hit, but were responding to a command. In the data, this manifested itself as a repeatability of the profile. First the corridor intensifies, then an impulse occurs, then the environment lets go and everything returns to the appearance of nothing happened. This is not chaos that works. This is a mechanism that has an on mode and an off mode, and it can open for a short time without unnecessary noise. While some tried to call it a coincidence, others began looking for a physical signature in the fields, and that's when the most frightening hint of a structure near Earth appeared. Solar wind sensors detected a sharp local bend in the flow. Not a global storm, but a slight deformation, as if the flow had rounded an invisible object. This does not look like a normal magnetic response from the Earth because the bending was too localized and quickly disappeared, as if it were associated with a point rather than the planet's shell. And this point coincided in time and direction with that very section of the sky where the background became flat, as if the space there had a different density or a different geometry. And here, for the first time, a hypothesis arose that no one wants to publish, because it sounds like science fiction even to those who are accustomed to strange objects. Perhaps 3i Atlas does not push the moon directly, but uses a working zone near Earth where the properties of the environment can be changed, as if the space there were controlled. If this is true, then the moon becomes a convenient target because it is perfectly measured, and every impulse can be assessed as if on a test bench. That is, someone does not break the system, but studies its reaction, checks how much the phase can be changed, what forces are needed, and how quickly the system stabilizes. The most unpleasant thing about this version is that it explains accuracy because in tests they don't want destruction. In tests they want repeatability and clean results. And that is precisely why the third impulse coincided with micro glitches in time on Earth, as if the working zone in space affects not only orbits, but also signal transmission. If you can slightly change the conditions for the signal to pass through, then you know how to work with how space conducts information, and this is already a different level of intervention. And if you know how to touch information, then the whole world around you becomes sensitive, because connection and synchronization are the nervous system of civilization. But there is another layer that makes everything worse. After the third touch, the moon began to behave as if it were holding the new regime more actively than before. It didn't just shift, it seemed to become more sensitive, as if its orbit had entered a subtle resonant zone where the next push would be easier. It's like swinging a pendulum. First you push hard, then the pendulum picks up the rhythm, and then a light touch is enough for the amplitude to grow. And this means that the next step may be more dangerous not because the shock will be stronger, but because the system is already prepared and reacts more easily. And here we return to the most pressing question: why change the tides at all? After all, this is not an effect for the sake of an effect, but an influence on the enormous mechanism of the Earth. If you wanted to hide your interference in the world, you would choose something that looks natural, and the ocean is ideal. It is always noisy and complex. It is a good place to hide your tracks. Therefore, the moon and the tides appear as a test site where micro adjustments can be made and the planet's reaction observed without society even realizing that an experiment is underway. And if this is an experiment, then it will not end after 3 checks, because any experiment is either stopped or moves on to the next phase. And the next phase is always closer to the goal because the calibration is complete. The corridor is working, the impulses are repeated, and now you can touch more vital parameters. After the third touch, the world did not change overnight, and that is the danger, because real systemic interventions do not explode reality, they simply shift it half a step. People continued to live, the news continued to circulate, but the ocean began to behave differently, and this is visible not with the eyes, but in long graphs, where the water no longer matches the old memory. The tidal shift did not hit the beaches, but rather the nodes where warm and cold masses mix, and it is there that the chains of consequences that later appear as a strange season are born. In some regions, the water has become slightly warmer where it shouldn't because mixing has changed the regime. In others, on the contrary, a cold layer has appeared, which disrupts the usual balance. It sounds like a small thing, but the climate depends on small things because the ocean stores heat like a battery, and if the battery starts to release energy differently, everything changes from above. That is why, after the third impulse, things emerged that no one had associated with the moon, but they connected themselves because they coincided too beautifully in phase and geography. In some places, fog has intensified, where it is usually rare. In other places, humidity has suddenly increased without the usual cause, and in other places, wind patterns have begun to shift according to schedule. Scientists initially tried to call this natural variation, but the problem is that variation does not like identical handwriting, and in this case, the handwriting was too stable. It looked like a setting, and a setting means that someone didn't just push the system, but fixed a new regime in which the ocean will continue to operate. The most terrifying thing was that the nodes of influence coincided with places where huge ocean currents pass, the kind that determine the weather of entire continents. If these currents change even by a percentage, it is not a change in the weather. It is a change in the character of the planet, simply spread out over time so as not to cause panic. And against this background, a new detail appeared that could not be ignored, because for the first time it looked like an active effect and not a side effect. At the moment of the next faint appearance of the three-eye corridor, Atlas gave a short signal, not a radio message in words, but a packet of repeating pulses and noise. It wasn't a transmission like in humans, but it was too organized to be called natural bursts. It repeated itself with almost perfect pitch. At first, the systems thought that this was a filter error, but different stations saw the same structure, and most importantly, it appeared exactly when the environment around the Earth was compressed. And here for the first time it became clear that the corridor is not just a zone of distortion, but an interface, because it reacts not only to movement, but also to rhythms. If you can make space behave like an interface, you can make it act like a channel, and a channel always implies flow control. This explained the strange micro glitches in time, because synchronization is also a flow, and if the environment changes the transmission conditions, the signal arrives differently. This time, delays occurred not only in satellite links, but also in some terrestrial, high-precision networks, as if the effect was occurring lower, closer to the surface. This usually happens during strong storms, but there were no storms, and it is doubly disgusting because the usual causes were absent, but the consequences manifested themselves. And it was then that oceanographers noticed another hard marker. Deep-sea oscillations began to coincide with the phase of the pulses, as if the tides had begun to listen to an external beat. It sounds crazy, but the data was stubborn. A corridor appears, a series of pulses appear, then the microphase in the ocean changes, and everything calms down again. That is, the Earth reacted like a feedback system, not like a stone in a vacuum, but like a mechanism in which a small external signal produces a large internal effect. And if it's feedback, then the next step is logical amplification, because anyone who tunes a system first checks the response, then turns the knob harder. The most unpleasant thing was that after each impulse, the moon became more obedient. The orbital tremor increased, but not chaotically, but as if it was being held in a narrow corridor. This looks like a resonant trap, where the system can no longer return to its original state without external intervention, because the new state is stabilized. At this point, people had a thought that made them want to stop observing, but stopping would not achieve anything, because you cannot cancel what is happening by closing your eyes. If Three-Eye Atlas is able to maintain access to our rhythm, then each subsequent contact will be easier, because the mechanism has already been found. The calibration has already been completed. The interface is open. And that means the goal may not be the moon or the tides, but rather testing how controllable the Earth is through its external environment without physical invasion. Because if you can change the ocean regime and communication networks, you can influence navigation, logistics, climate nodes, everything at once, but slowly and quietly. This kind of control doesn't look like an attack, it looks like an era of strange coincidences, and people will argue about the reasons until the system is already living by the new rules. And the scary thing is that this scenario doesn't require a lot of energy, it requires the right point of application, and the corridor seems to be exactly that point. And then things get even darker, because new data hints that there is more than one corridor, and that it may be built sequentially along the object's trajectory. If there are several corridors, it means it is a network, and a network means a route, and a route means a goal, because no one builds meaningless networks.